Welcome to this Royal Television Society Thames Valley webinar. I'm delighted that we've got some wonderful guests today to talk about what is one of the most iconic television programs there is. It's been going for quite a number of years now. In fact, it's a program that inspired me to want to be an OB director. And in fact, I would always like to have done it, but it was one that I didn't manage to do. So it's one of the things on my miss list. But it has been a year. All the things that we've done in the past in OBs have had to change. We've had to look at doing things differently. But I think today it's going to be really interesting to see how this iconic church service has dealt with what is an extraordinary situation, probably with uncertainty throughout the year as to what was actually going to happen. So that having been said, I'd like to introduce our guests. It should have been Pamela Hosick, who was originally planned to do this event. She unfortunately became indisposed, and Ian was called in at the last minute, well, relatively last minute. So it will be interesting to hear not only the complications of having to do it in a different way, but also to have to come in fairly late in the day to take over this responsibility. And we do wish Pamela well. Bernie Davis, who again is a very distinguished lighting director. He spoke to us at Thames Valley before about 5 weddings and a funeral that he'd taken part and lit. And Peter Taylor, it used to be called engineering managers, but it's not now. It's a lot more than that. Peter's got an interesting background because he's also a musician and got a degree in music. So it'd be really interesting to see how that particularly benefits on this particular event. Bernie, before we start, I think you did tell me that the Eurovision Song Contest and King's College carols may have some connection. What is that?
Loosely, yes. It was the 100th anniversary of the 9 Lessons and Carols service that is Carols from King's quite recently, and it made me look into it a little further. The service itself came about after the First World War, when the Dean wanted to present a gift to the citizens of Cambridge, and he brought in this service, which was very successful and came in every year. Well, 10 years later, the British Broadcasting Company, as I suppose it would have been then, covered it for radio. So radio history goes back to 1928, and I believe they've been there every year since then. TV came in a little later, but not that early. 1954 was the first time TV cameras went there, and it was part of the Television Continental Exchange. It's at a time of growth in television around Europe, and companies wanted to share programs. So that year they introduced an exchange of programs earlier in the year, which, despite the odds, was quite successful. And so they decided they wanted to expand it further. And that Christmas, there were 3 programs. Well, I believe there's a piano concert as well. I'm not sure how it fits in with this, but the Christmas Eve was Midnight Mass from Paris. The night before that, on the 23rd, was Carols from King's, or 9 Lessons and Carols as it was called then. And then on Christmas Day, Winter Sports from Switzerland, all live around Europe. So 1954, this service went to 9 countries live.
Amazing. And so it's really interesting that this had a formative part in the whole Eurovision network being formed.
That was part of the start of Eurovision, yes.
Well, let's go back on this event to the planning, which is always important in these. But Peter, I noticed, I did look on YouTube and I saw a Carols from King's in 2006, and in the credits it had both you and Bernie doing it. So you have got some experience on this show. So presumably planning it is not too much of a strain. Just get the technical requirements out, change the date, and have a glass of wine.
Yeah, well, if only that were the case. Of course, every year throws up fresh challenges and differences. I have to say this year was by far and away one of the biggest that we've ever had to deal with. Yes, I'm a comparative new boy on the Carols from King's team. Bernie, I think you've done probably about 10 more than I have, but I joined, and I think I've started in about 2004 or 5. And I've done all but one of those ever since. I missed 1 year because I was in South Africa the year that Nelson Mandela died. So I was out of the country and unfortunately not able to be in Cambridge. For me, and I think for most of the rest of the team who work on it, it is very much a highlight of the year. I tend to work on a lot of sort of one-off shows. I work within the BBC events and music teams and tend to get dragged into the things that we haven't done before or that have particular complications. So in many ways, Carols from Kings is my only repeat show. And yes, you're right that it would be nice just to change the date on all the planning documents, but that really isn't the case. We often have to deal with changes. For instance, there's the building works that happen around the place that these ancient buildings require a lot of maintenance. And this year, of course, we had to deal with trying to achieve as normal a service as possible within the COVID restrictions.
Yeah, so just thinking back to the year as it works out, there's normally a routine. I don't know, when do you start sort of having first meetings? In March or sometime? Just to...
For Kings tends not to be. We normally have a bit of a wash up after the previous year. We tend to know the dates of the recordings. It's important to remember that this is a recorded programme. It's not live, and it is, perhaps we should say, it is different. Our colleagues from radio do go back and do a live service from Kings every Christmas Eve. And the radio programme is the traditional 9 lessons and carols format, whereas Carols from Kings is a television construct, I think it's probably fair to say, with often a more audience-friendly choice of music. There are a lot more warm and friendly carols that people will know. We start relatively early on, but because the team tends to be the same people year on year, it tends to be a fairly light hand until we get towards the end of the summer. I know from the production team's point of view, though, they are in contact with the director of music and the dean very early on in the year, and they start moulding the content. Again, from that point of view, it's not just another regurgitation of while shepherds watch their flocks by night. It's often there will be a new commission, and frequently there will be things that need to be marked. Last year was the first year that Daniel Hyde did the service, and we obviously were thinking very much at that point of Stephen Clearbury, who had been the director of music at Kings for very many years, who sadly died just before we went to record. So it was a very emotional service last year. It was a very emotional service this year, and it changed at the last minute due to some availability issues around the choir in terms of COVID.
Okay, let's just go back to in the course of the year, because I think many of us have been involved in events this year, and we started off thinking, well, it's going to happen, this will all go away, and then as we went through the year, we found it was much more serious. So when did you begin to realize that if this happened, which was always a big if with a lot of events, if it happened, it was going to be different? And what impact did that have on your thinking with regard to planning?
It became very clear very early on that we would not have a congregation. If we were able to go ahead at all, obviously the Church of England was preventing people from singing at all in churches until really quite recently, which has been a huge problem for the choristers and the choir, because they haven't had the rehearsal time. The issue, I guess, is that we wanted to try and work out how we would reflect the congregational style and make it still feel like a church service rather than a Christmassy songs of praise type thing. It needed still to feel like something worshipful.
Presumably one option would have been for Bernie just to switch the lights out on the congregation and put a bit more on the windows. I mean, that in the old days is probably what people would have done.
Indeed, and well, Bernie will, I'm sure, tell you about how he made the whole place glisten in the way that he always does, without any people to light it. What we also looked at, should we have a virtual congregation? Various ideas like that went round. I think all of us were quite pleased that idea actually went away, because it would have been it would have jarred, I think, no matter how we had done it with
what thinking, that's really interesting, because what thinking did go into that? Because clearly we've seen light entertainment shows where virtual audiences have been put in.
Obviously, because it's a recorded program, it's possible to go and in post put in a load of Zoom type things if you want to do that. We also looked at potentially putting some screens into, we were going to, at one point, recording in the antechapel, which is the half of the chapel you never see on the television, and having some screens there with people joining in the congregational hymns. In the end, I think probably sense in many ways prevailed, and it was decided that that would just be such a television artifice, particularly for this. And also, I think what people are after, I think at the moment, is some degree of normality. So we had discussions about how much in the programme we made reference to COVID, whether we'd need to do some sort of explaining at the beginning to say this has all been done within COVID. I actually think we're all heartily sick of it, and actually we're all desperate for that warmth and some sort of normal Christmassy thing. If you're tuning in to Carol from Kings, you know the product and you want and you know what to expect, and actually you don't need a lecture on washing your hands.
I know there are some people on the call, Peter, who will be interested in the kit. I mean, there are people like me who last time they touched anything in anger was a BBC Type 5 scanner, I think, which is back in the Stone Age. The stuff you have now is pretty smart, isn't it? Can you just give us a quick roundup of the kit you used for this?
You'll see that for the first time, I think, ever, we had a jib included in the lineup of cameras. And normally we can't operate around the chapel with a jib because it's full of the congregation who sit and would be in the way of such an operation. So actually it gave us the freedom to do some very different stuff, which I know that Ian enjoyed in terms of that. Also, the normal style of this event is that whilst it is a recording, the conceit is that it is a live event. So we would record the service from beginning to end and then patch. So unless something really quite disastrous musically or technically goes wrong in the run of the service, we don't stop. We just carry on. We get to the end with the congregation still present. We'll offer them the chance to hear again a couple of their favourite moments, which we got wrong somewhere along the line, and patch those. And then for the edit later on, we'll patch musical items just with the choir and the organ. We didn't have the congregation this year, so we could take a more rehearse record approach. Here's the parking area outside, but that's the setup. We work at the moment. We're working with Arena TV as our outside broadcast contractor. We also work with the Sound Alliance, who provide the sound truck. There's a film and TV generator there, and the remotes come from ACS. So that's, in a way, in the way of the BBC now, of course, is we don't own our own television resources. It's all hired in. I'm still a member of BBC staff, and I suppose I coordinate the different elements as it comes together. So there is a sort of element of the circus is in town, and I'm some sort of ringmaster occasionally.
So in your role now, as opposed to the old EMs, you actually have a purchasing role, presumably.
Yeah, I try not to be. We try to get over the customer client thing fairly quickly, because actually I don't think it helps anybody if I'm banging it. Well, it says in the contract, that's not very creative. What we tend to do is work. We're very fortunate in this country. The outside broadcast facility suppliers are absolutely world class, and so it's a difficult choice to pick between different people. Arena are doing it at the moment. CTV, another big player in the OB market, did it for a number of years. So yeah, we work as far as we can with the same teams. I'm just going to see if there's in terms of the remotes, just to come back to that. It's still important. The remotes enabled us to do things with cameras because of COVID. So because they don't have operators standing behind them, getting close to the choristers would have been nigh on impossible. with an ordinary cameras. The distancing is such. I think it's probably worth just saying at this point that the lineup was changed. We were joined at the very last minute by the King's Singers, as opposed to the men of King's College Choir, which I think has now been made public, because two of the men from the choir went down with symptoms and couldn't sing. The boys form a bubble and therefore are able to sing together, and they live together. The King's Singers form a professional bubble and work together. But of course, we were not part of either of those bubbles and needed to be kept separate.
I want to go over to Ian now, because that's really taken us nicely into what I'd like to ask him about. Ian, obviously earlier in the year, you had no idea you'd be doing this. I keep calling them shows, and I get told off for calling them shows, but you know what I mean. This event, you didn't know you were doing. When did you actually know that you were called upon to do it?
It's true to say earlier in December, I don't think I knew, or just about the turn of the month, probably, was when it was all forming up and coming to light. So a lot of the planning, a lot of the work had already been done by Peter, by Bernie, and by Pamela, who was to have directed it, and the rest of the production team. So I had to sort of slot in and pick up the pieces with a week or two to go.
So what were your first thoughts? Busk it.
No, absolutely not. First thoughts were that it can't be busked. I think that television these days has to be much more precise in its execution. I think it compares itself, or has to be compared in the viewers' minds, to film much more often, or the sort of things that they might see on Netflix. If you think that all of us on the panel here have at one point or another been involved with, say, royal weddings, and the coverage of the royal weddings from places like St Paul's or Westminster Abbey has been amazing. But now that Netflix have done series like The Crown and had sets built and been able to film in a way that you can never film live on an OB, I think the standards are pushed higher, because the viewing public expects those big occasions to look as tidy and planned and as filmic as those productions on Netflix and other such channels. So King's, being one of those jewels in the crown, jewels in the BBC crown, has to sort of measure up to that as much as possible. And in order to have any chance of achieving that, it has to be planned down to the last crotchet.
You really didn't have a lot of time. I think when we spoke beforehand, I did mention to you that I suppose I started seeing the beginning of scripting on these OB events. There were some of my predecessors, you'd almost see the service sheet rolled up in their back pocket with a few notes on. And they would, to some extent, go and busk these events. And as someone following, you thought that's the way it was done. And it was when I came up against Jim Popel at ITV on a royal wedding, and he turned up to a planning meeting with this big, thick folder with a whole script in it. I thought, blimey, this guy's thought about it. He's prepared. I better do the same. And it made me suddenly think about scripting these events. So you didn't have long to do that. How did you set about scripting this one?
It's the way which I've scripted similar occasions before. So I, for example, covered the funeral service at Westminster Abbey of the Queen Mother when that happened. And the same basic scripting process applies there as it does to a prom that you might do, or another sort of classical music program. So we gathered together the order of service from the Abbey, and I can share, if you're happy, I can share a little bit of this.
Love to see it.
You'll have to excuse my scribble.
Did you ever look at it when you were shooting it?
It's one of the things, being a director, you have to have your eyes on the screen, eyes on the preview monitors, and eyes down at the script all at the same time. So I find that particularly hard, because you can't really. But it looks in places like a conventional script, with shot numbers and cameras and shot descriptions. And this is unsurprisingly, King's is one of the things I wanted to do, is get immersed in the tradition of King's, being a new boy, because I worked on King's, even now I've worked on King's for the same number of days that people have worked years on King's. So I did want to sort of represent that heritage really well, and it was bound to be different because of COVID and because of the way we were having to shoot it. But I didn't want to make it wholesale different where
Tell me about that one, Ian. Shot 2 on 4 or 5, and you've written 6 question mark in.
Well,
Now, we all know that once in Royal David City, or allegedly, I'm sure this is true, the person who's singing that doesn't actually know, do they, until a few minutes beforehand?
That's part of the King's tradition. I can stop sharing now. There are auditions because of course everyone's voice has good days and bad days, and so maybe something like the top 3 young choristers are auditioned, and that can change just moments before you go to record. So that, if I go back to share that screen, those 3 cameras were needed simply because they could have been on one side of the choir or the other side of the choir. And because they could have been nearer the conductor or further away, cameras get better shots. So there were a choice of 3 cameras just to get that first shot. But if I scroll down, the sort of conventional television script format, as soon as we get to the next music item, if I get past here, it goes into much more like a proms or a classical music scripting format, because you can see the different musical parts, the different voices are going to sing, and that influences your shot choices hugely. So just because this looks, well, you can see everyone singing much the same thing at much the same time there, but it isn't always the case. So that you have to look at the way the music's arranged to work out how you want to sing it, and then you can get.
Is the script supervisor bar counting on this?
They're bar counting in a variety of ways. In the more conventionally scripted way, they're bar counting in a conventional television way, shot calling. And then when you get to the score, it's the classical music bar counting when there's still a shot number, shot 19 on camera 2, for example. But the numbers, if you've got a moving shot, the numbers go backwards. So you count 4, 3, 2, 1, and when you hit 0, the jib operator in this case knows it's time to steady the shot because there's a shot change coming up. So it's a whole mix of different sort of disciplines to make that work.
So did you have late nights doing this?
It was quite a lot of long days. I think that was, as much as anything, a factor or 2 factors. Because I joined so late, I had to get to know the music, and I had to get to follow the music. And sometimes you're following a score, which is a new piece of music. Peter said there are new commissions or new arrangements, and you're given a guide track, which might be a completely different arrangement. And you have to notice the differences and spot. I'm not terribly musical. I've learned how to sort of work my way through a script, having done proms and other such things. But you have to learn to sort of find your way through that so that you can predict the shot. So I set about that process fairly close to the wire. They were 4 or 5 long days just getting the first pass of the script done. And just as that got sent to the printers, 48 hours before we were due to record, came the news that Peter said that yet another set of changes were about to be inflicted upon us, because 2 of the King's Singers, 2 of the male choir, the music scholars from the King's College Choir, had tested positive, and therefore they had to self-isolate. They're fine. It was all good. The symptoms weren't severe, but very short notice, the King's Singers stepped in, and the 6 voices of the King's Singers made up for something like the 15 voices of the male choir, and we had to change the layout, and a process of re-scripting had to start in the days before recording.
So tell me about the spacing that you had to do. Presumably the choristers are fine because they live in a boarding school together, so they're in a bubble.
The King's Singers were also in a bubble. They've got a professional performing bubble, so actually there were some advantages. Every change, right, there's advantages as well as disadvantages. So the male singers, the music scholars who were to have sung, would have to have socially distanced. So they had to be 2 meters apart minimum, which makes finding lovely shots slightly harder. But the King's Singers couldn't be as close to the boy choristers, but they could stay together in their bubble, and the boy choir from King's College could stay in their bubble. So it gave us advantages, although it did give us quite a lot of extra re-scripting in terms of camera scripting to do.
No, I know. As directors, we're always thinking about the shots, and we hate it when people hang microphones in the middle of the master shot. But presumably, the sound department had some challenges here as well, because you haven't got a classic choir layout, or the source of the singing is in a different formation. And I was brought up to believe, the classic place is a coincident pair over the back of the conductor's head. You don't need anything else. And with these sort of choirs, that's what you expect the balance to be. But presumably, this spacing had changed the sound perspective.
The rearrangement changes everything. So yes, that does include sound, and we're very, very lucky that we've got one of the best sound supervisors. He's worked on King's for many years, Andy Payne, and his colleague Matthew Charles. They're such a team of two, and such an amazing pair. And I think Andy's philosophy is to keep the coverage as simple as he can. He doesn't want too many mics because that overly complicates things. He's very particular about the placement of the mics that he does have, so that he gets the best sound possible and the balance between them. But in some ways it was more simple because there wasn't a congregation. There didn't need to be mics to cover the singing of the congregation. So when the change came, I guess there was an extra sling that had to go in, positioned above the King singers specifically for those 6 voices. And those slings are constantly adjusted during the early stages of the rehearsal process, so he gets the best balance.
Sorry to interrupt Ian's flow, but just to explain how this, obviously we don't want a load of microphone stands all in every shot poking out of everybody's heads. When our colleagues from BBC Radio come to do their coverage, they can put stands wherever they like, because nobody needs to see it, other than for safety's sake, not tripping over them. So what you can see here is the sort of cobweb of microphone leads coming down from the ceiling. And you might think, well, hang on, how are they hanging a load of stuff out of a ceiling there? Have we been around and drilled a load of holes in the roof of Henry VI Chapel? And the answer is that the holes were there when they built the chapel. So the vaulting at the top of the apex of each of the fan vaults, there is a hole, which was, I guess, where the medieval scaffold bits went through, which would have been wooden at the time. And what happens is that we fly down the wires from those points, join the microphones all together with the slings, and then pull them up into the correct position so that they hang in exactly the location that Andy wants to place them. And one other little King's secret, because everybody loves a King's secret, is that there is one hole that was drilled in the roof, I hasten to add, not by the BBC, but by, I believe, EMI, when they made some recordings in the 1920s in King's College Chapel. And above the centre boss, above the organ, I think I probably just about pointed out, I think it's this one here, just off to the left of it, there is a hole through which you can dangle a single microphone, which allows you to put a microphone directly above the organ box here, where there is a lot of lovely sparkly sound that you can't get any other way. And we discovered this, actually, I think it may have been a thing forgotten in the mists of times, but I think Andy found the hole and said, oh, I wonder what this is for, and discover it anew. So that's the King's microphone rig, which it's quite a fun thing to see. It's a very clever thing of beauty to see it being put together, I have to say.
Ian, just a quick one on, I get the impression from what you said, I think absolutely interesting, you say about the crown and how one looks at that and you get used to seeing even the events portrayed in the crown shot like a film. But Ian, do you feel you've been spoilt now? You've been able to do an event like this and shoot it like a film. When the audience stroke congregation come back in, you're going to have to go back to the old ways, because we all know how we've been told off either by the authorities or what have you for cameras getting in the way and everything. But you on this occasion have been able to have the opportunity to shoot it rather differently. Do you feel you've been spoilt?
Well, I think in many ways I've been spoilt. I think that the change that COVID brought, i.e. no congregation, the biggest change, presented challenges. Any change presents challenges. You have to rethink things. But with change, as well as disadvantages, comes advantages. going back to sound, Andy and Matt was saying that in some ways the sound was so much more simple because they didn't have that sort of noise floor of just people in the chapel echoing around a very reverberant place. They didn't have coughing to remove. They didn't have people dropping their program or their song sheets on the floor. But what they did have instead was a very, very empty, clean sound, very, very open. So if there was a little noise or remove, it was really much more apparent than it would have been with the congregation there. So there was a problem with the sound. In terms of the camera shots, the jib that Peter showed, for the first time, we were able to have a jib. We decided not to have a very big jib. It was just a 9-foot jimmy jib that we used because that gave it, it was easier to use on the fly. It was easier to hide from other camera shots when we didn't want to see it in the back of other shots. We decided it was the most versatile length to try and use. And also we didn't want to take things too far and have too bigger jibbing shots that would be perhaps a too big departure from the King's convention, so that the audiences used to King's will still in some way be used to this. But every time an event has happened with a change because of COVID, it's brought advantages. You could say the same with the proms this year. It was odd to start listening to the proms without an audience in the Albert Hall. But when you started listening to the music, you soon forgot about the audience, and the coverage was improved because there was a jib in the middle of the Albert Hall on the arena floor, and it got the sort of shots that you couldn't get at a proms with an audience in it ever. And similarly, again, at the proms, there are advantages in the social distancing between the musicians, made the sound cleaner. There was less spill between the microphones covering musicians. So, you know, you have to embrace those advantages. And I think, having been through those sort of processes, whether it's the proms or King's or somewhere else, there are lessons to be learned. And I think it's important that we do learn those lessons and try and adopt some of the practices that we've discovered this year and use them in years to come.
Bernie, you've been doing it for a number of years. Has the technology changed over the years? I mean, I remember those lamps that we used to use that would melt the candles, and the amount of heat and light that needed to be generated to get a signal into the camera. It's, of course, camera and lights have changed now. LEDs have been revolutionary in what they brought to TV lighting. What's your perspective on the changes you've seen over the years, particularly on an event like this?
Well, the changes I've seen have been a few, but I came in just after a fairly major change, which was that the previous lighting director to me, Peter Webb, he had been charged with redesigning the lighting because they used to use scaffolding attached to the walls. There were scaffold couplers fitted to the walls, and you know, relatively large lights attached to it for lighting the choir in particular, and for lighting all directions they could from there. And it was pretty ugly, and it was pretty ugly for the rest of the year. So he was charged with coming up with a new way of doing it. This is the chapel itself. I'm sure everyone's seen the chapel, but it's a big open space. There's not really anywhere to hide a lot of the lighting. This is down in the choir end. And you can see there's a lot of daylight comes in as well. What hasn't been mentioned so far, by the way, is that normally when we record the Carols of Kings, we start at 3 o'clock when the sun, if there is sun on that day, is still on the walls opposite. It's low, but it's still in the sky, and it goes down during the service. And by the time we finish, it's of course completely nighttime. But even in that picture, you can see there's nowhere to put lighting that wouldn't be rather obtrusive and somewhat limiting for the shots. This is not a brilliant picture, but of the choir woodwork. So if you can see my cursor here, up on these columns between the windows is where they used to have these scaffold couplers, and scaffolding would be rigged above this woodwork to light opposite and up and down the chapel. That's what he was told they wanted to get rid of. So he realized that cameras were getting more sensitive. They could put small lights on this woodwork. So when I inherited the lighting, that was one of the main sources of lighting was on this woodwork. The only trouble is, from there, it's relatively shallow angle into the choir opposite, and you'll get shadows of the candles there. So he came up with an ingenious idea that if we pushed the lighting a bit further, every one of these candles here is lit and producing quite a bit of light on the choristers. It wasn't quite enough light, but it was a pretty good start. But in the base of each of these holders is a small 10 or 15 watt tungsten bulb that would light down onto the music for the choir. And so he thought, well, if we could somehow raise that and put a window in there, we could let that light leak out and light the choir from a very natural angle with no shadows. So he got somebody from BBC Workshops to come down and measure it up. So this is inside. More recently, these are now LED lights inside, but this is with the candle holder taken off, and there's holes in the bottom where the light leaks through onto the music. And he thought the sleeve in there would allow the light to come through and help the lighting. So they measured this up, and the Workshops guy who'd done it drove back to the Kendal Avenue outside broadcast base thinking, where am I going to get a bit of tube that's exactly that size? Well, the vehicle barrier that goes into Kendal Avenue was one of those typical swing pole barriers. And of course, trucks go in and out, it's always getting broken. And sure enough, it's lying there snapped off in the road. He thought, that looks very similar to the size I want. Measured it and it was perfect. So, so he whipped it into Workshops, sawed it up into lengths, milled windows in it, sprayed them gold, and came up with these. So he made 69 of these, which we still have and use to this day. I've since fitted this reflector inside in a diffuser window just to spread the light a bit more. But it's a very good natural angle to light from. This is one in operation. Some of them have got two windows, so where there's a bit more spacing, we can put the double windows in. And then this is one of the chapel staff lighting a candle, and you can see how naturally her face is lit from that tungsten light inside. The only difference these days is because they've got LED lights in there now, I have to go around and change all their lights back to tungsten. So I've got a big box of 15 watt bulbs. So I change everything to tungsten before the service, and then before I leave, I have to change it all back to their LED.
But Bernie, in your experience, has LED been a real revolution in lighting, particularly for these sort of events?
Yes, it has. As everything, it's got good and bad. Some of the lighting fixtures can be slightly green, and you have to be careful of that to get the colour right. But they use so much less power, and in fact, there's a lot of good moving lights you can use these days, which means you can focus from the floor without having to get ladders out. You can refocus. You can refocus during a show. You can have different focuses for the same light doing different things.
So were you using moving heads on this event?
No, not on this one. No. It's the rig has mostly stayed the same. To be honest, I don't put a lot of light in. And what I would say about this choir lighting is that of all the things in the service that we're going to look at, the choir is the only thing I don't put any light on. They're completely lit by these candles and these bulbs. All the lighting I put in is lighting the walls, the Rubens painting, the congregation, it's the ceiling, it's everything but the choir. In fact, one year when we were doing retakes in the evening, I accidentally hit the blackout button and nobody noticed. How
did you deal with that, where there's an important component of the event, you know, the congregation, who are not there? What do? Do you sort of pretend they're not there, or make it so that you can't see where they were, or do you take the architecture and accept there are holes there?
Well, I would judge it by what I saw on the day, but in fact, the designer Stephen Graham brought along some candelabra, which dressed the altar end of the chapel nicely. It filled up some space, and it was enough. If he'd done too much, it would have looked wrong. It would have, you know, as Peter said on site, it could have become candles from Kings, which it shouldn't be. But the balance was good, and you know, it's a candlelit show with a lot of candles in there, so it looked quite natural to have them up there. But in fact, normally when we do Kings, I have to fade out the congregation for most of it because they are sitting, fidgeting in their Christmas jumpers and can be a distraction behind shots. And in fact, the congregation that are near the organ is also the area where the peds come in and get shots. So I take the lighting out of that area to hide the cameras and to hide the congregation. And then I just fade them up when we have the community carols. So on this occasion, I actually left the what I consider the audience lighting up all the way through because it lit the walls and the building and the space around the candelabra. So that was actually it's not a great deal of lighting, but that never went out. So rather than fade out, I was actually adding things. What you can see in here is there's just these kind of, it's not a great deal, but it was just enough to fill what was otherwise a large empty space at that end. There's usually a lot of chairs there, and obviously there was no point in putting the chairs out with nobody to sit in them. But it made it look very comfortable without being cluttered or gimmicky.
Bernie, you say there's not a great deal, but of course Stephen, the designer, had to allow quite a lot of time to make sure that he could light them all safely and properly. There's a lot of candle lighting needed in the schedule.
Yes, well, there certainly is, and also mats to collect the wax that was going to drop on the floor otherwise. So yeah, it wasn't done without considerable thought.
I can see Nick Gilby has got his hand up. Nick, the mic is yours.
It's a very intimate space compared with Westminster Abbey, and we were talking earlier about a filmic look, and it's enabled you, hasn't it, to be able to do that. I'm just thinking, I didn't see any park hands there, and there was much more sort of closer lighting. I just wonder if you'd like to comment about that.
Thanks, Nick.
Yes, well, remember that I'm not lighting the choir at all. If I could just share my screen a second. So this is the choir lit with their candles and their spacers. You can see the spacers in there. If you didn't know how it was done, I don't think many people would look at that and wonder what that was. So that already looks quite filmic to me because it's a soft light from the right place without anything giving away how it was lit. It just looks like it's the candles. You can see here the candle. This is the choir stalls, so these are the holders all in place. The only place.
Bernie,
yes?
sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to say those two pictures. I wondered if we'd have a chance to look at this, because the pictures when you've done the lighting and the pictures when the house lights are up or lots of daylight's coming. These two pictures you've just shown this looks really quite. It's a lovely building, but it still looks comparatively unflat. It's not terribly nice. The shot before looked filmic and gorgeous, Bernie. That's the difference you make.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. And it's taking care to put light where it's needed and not where it's not needed. And in this picture, I've really around the choir. I've only got 4 positions I can put lights since I can't use that woodwork anymore. And right in the corner there's a little pylon. It's not obvious even in that photograph how it's done, but there's a vertical truss in the corner strapped to the woodwork with a black drape over it, and somehow we get away with that in shot. On the next picture,
What are those lights, Bernie? Because I'm sure some people will be interested.
There's I can only fit so many on there. I've got a few small Fresnels which light the congregation. I've got, for instance, from there I've got one that lights the congregation who would be near the organ. I've got another one which lights the space in there, roughly where the conductor would go. I've got 2 profile spots which light the woodwork. This woodwork, being almost black, would disappear on camera if we didn't do anything with it. So I've got 2 profiles that light in both directions along it. So they've got a cool blue in them, so it kind of glints almost like it's moonlight on it. But I don't think you're really aware of it being lit. It simply looks right behind people who are candlelit. And then I've got a little light that lights down into a reader position. And I've got one light that lights up the walls because the window frames don't look right if you have no light spilling on the walls. So there's only a handful of lights there. There's also one profile for lighting what we normally consider the solo position. This year it was the King's Singers. So I've normally got a profile there. Now that's a very shallow angle for lighting singers in there, but by picking the right side, I can get around the microphones that are in the middle. It worried me when the King's singers were going in, because Andy needed to drop 2 more microphones in, and my lights are so shallow, there's a great danger of getting shadows. But in fact, he was way above my lights. But what there was a single drop that had gone in from where the socially spaced older choir singers would have been, and there wasn't time to take those out. So they were there, and that was right in line with those lights. But when I stood in the positions where the choir were going to be, the shadow fell directly between 2 singers, which is perfect. If it hadn't, I could have moved the light a bit, so hopefully put the shadow where it wasn't seen. But luckily, it was exactly the right place. So I had no shadow problems at all from there.
Thanks, Bernie. Ian, I think you've set a hair running here with the filmic look, which I think is fantastic. I think it's wonderful. It's something we'd always aspired to, but never really had the opportunity to do it. Phil Dolling has asked a question as to whether you shoot progressive or interlace, and whichever you do, why do you do it that way?
Well, it's like most television, it's shot interlaced. Most proper broadcast television is still shot interlaced in terms of an OB. That's how OB. Can you
just explain for folks who don't know the technicalities of that?
So this is going back to my engineering days, so I might have to ask Peter to help. But interlaced is the television lines that make up a picture are drawn down from the top, and interlaced, it just draws all the odd numbered lines in first, then all the even numbered lines to double or half the flicker rate in effect. And that's how television was invented, to help with your persistence of vision, to stop that flickering happening. Film is more conventionally shot at 25 or 24 frames a second, and it's the flicker is got rid of by the way it's projected. And a progressive picture just draws all the lines in one after the other, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and that quite often is said to give a more filmic look, because that's the way film is shot. I'm dubious about that. I think you can achieve a filmic look by the way you treat the pictures, by the way you light. The way Bernie's lit this is half the battle to achieving a filmic look. As you could see from those 2 pictures, if you don't light it, it's never going to look filmic. And the other thing is the extraordinary things you can do in terms of vision control now. You know, we have absolutely the top team. One of the things about stepping into this at the last minute was that the team assembled, who've all done it for many a year, are at the top of their game. And Giles Hiscox, who's the vision supervisor on this, is just, I've worked with him for ages, and is just one of the best. And he's got controls on cameras like gammas and things that you didn't really used to have in the old days. And so you can, by changing the curve and the response to the light over that sort of pitch black to 100% white, you can make it look more filmic. I think if you did that sort of vision control, that's where you achieve the filmic look, really.
Take the film analogy a little further. Obviously, a film cameraman leaves latitude in what's shot in the camera. Traditionally, video, it's rendered at the head of the camera. Now, I know the event is in post at the moment. How much latitude is there for some more tweaking of the look and feel in post with an event like this?
There's always latitude to tweak in post, but I think it's one of the good things about OBs is they can get a long way there without needing that latitude, because you've got a really experienced crew around you. You've got fantastic vision engineers, lighting directors. You can get a really long way there. So occasionally there might just be something that can be helped a little bit in post, especially if something's taken out of sequence and the daylight has shifted or something. You can help when you need to. But the whole aim of having a really top OB team is to see what you're seeing. You don't need to shoot in S-Log or do those things. You don't have to spend weeks and months in post if you get it right while you're recording it, which is what that caliber of team can do. I don't know, Bernie or Peter, if you want to talk about the filmic.
Yeah, I'd like to add something about the vision control, because you're right, Giles is just one of the best. I've worked with him for many years, and I'm always impressed with what he does, and his nature and his overall understanding of what everybody's doing is absolutely second to none. You mentioned earlier that on a normal year about how we would record the service in real time and then patch later. That does produce a problem because any sound patches are fine, except that if we have to record pictures, we're now at night time, whereas when we started recording, it was daytime with quite a lot of daylight bouncing around. Even if there's not direct sunshine, there's quite a lot of blue lift to everything. And when we do those retakes, Giles has the recording to refer to. So when we're doing it, he'll look to see what the pictures look like, and he can bend the pictures using gamma and color to get it looking as close as he can to how it was. The only trouble with that is that, of course, he can make the faces look better, but he's now bending how the candles look. But so he has to choose carefully how he does that. Sometimes you can watch Kings, you see a cutaway shot, and the pictures look fine, except the candle changes a little. But we've got
the candle length, Bernie, because of course the candles burn down.
Yes.
And we suddenly find that there's a candle continuity horror.
Yes, but we've got a new tool for the colour now, which we haven't been able to use yet. Which is that this year, for the first time, Kings had a new house light system put in, which is all LED. It's all colour tuning, and it can go right from very warm tungsten to very cold daylight, and produces a wash over the floor. I can drive that from my lighting desk. So in fact, this year, to help the space look better on the floor, I was able to add a sort of an orangey glow as if from candles over the whole floor, which I think added to this year's look. But it does mean that next year, if we do retakes, I can do the same thing with cool light. So I'll be working with Giles on those retakes to try and get the ambient light in there a bit more like the daylight as it had been when we recorded.
Of course, Bernie, you could go really film, and you could put a big 10K outside the west window, and then you don't worry about the sun going down.
We funnily enough, I didn't mention that earlier, but all the windows have lights outside them.
Yeah, I thought they might.
And of course that is not realistic because those windows in real life would go black, but they just look so nice. We put lights out there, and we just ignore reality. But if you bear with me just a second, I'll show you what that looks like. That's the chapel lit, and you can see the light coming in through the windows. So even that west window at the far end has got a 6K coming through it. These windows on the north side have got lights coming through, and you can see them lighting up the wall on the opposite side. These windows have got light coming through and lighting up further down because there's a different angle. So this isn't really how it looks on camera, but I've exaggerated slightly in Photoshop to show what the lighting's doing. But that's the whole empty chapel lit.
Bernie, they must be some of the most expensive gobos that you ever use in the year, aren't they? Those windows.
Yes, if only through their age. Yes.
It might be just worth mentioning the cameras as well. In terms of we have done a UHD version of Kings. We did it experimentally. I think it was 2 years ago that we captured the program in UHD, partly because it was going to be Stephen Clearbury's last year with us. He was retiring, but also because we were able to do that. And I also, we weren't commissioned in UHD, but I persuaded the OB team to give us the cameras at the same price, partly because I wanted to do it with the leisure of not having to deliver it in UHD. So we had a year where we captured for an HD program, but using UHD cameras and UHD lenses. Posed a few interesting problems because actually the UHD cameras are not quite as sensitive as the HD versions. And in fact, this year we went back to HD cameras, HD lenses, partly just to get that extra stop of light that we can get out of them. So it's been an interesting thing. I think one of the things that in future iterations, when we can go to HDR capture as well within the UHD, the candlelit element will be fantastic. Of course, we at that point won't be able to hide anything in the black areas around the back of things, and the design element is going to rocket up in costs, which is not without its problems.
The clock is beating us. Ian, very finally, one quick comment of what's your takeaway? What do you personally take away from doing this year? What's your memory?
It's a memory of lots of long days and hard work, but one of absolute pleasure to be involved with such an OB And I think having a jib and a moving camera is something that will probably remain a part of King's for years to come.
Bernie, Ian, Peter, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been a real privilege, and I've just enjoyed sitting and listening to three masters of their trade talking about this incredible event that you've done. We all look forward to it. Well, transmission time is when? Christmas Eve?
5:30, five-ish, isn't it?
5:30.
Yeah.
5:30, BBC Two.
So people will be seeing that daylight coming in at 5:30 and wondering how it was done, Bernie. You'll be just saying, oh, put lights outside, that's how it was done. But thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. I hope that this has been useful to you. And I hope in future that we can get students watching these events, because if anything would make me want to work in television, it's listening to three people like this, talking about clearly the enjoyment they get out of it, but the enjoyment that obviously the viewers get from their work. So thank you again. It just leaves it to me to wish everyone a very happy Christmas and a very hopefully successful 2021. None of us know what it's going to bring, but I know we've all learned a lot in the past year, and some of it will be staying with us as we go into the next year for the better, actually, in the way we do things.